to Lens on Africa. It's about that time where we have our weekly discuss, but before we do, here is a short backgrounder to set the pace.
Nation building is the process whereby a society of people with diverse origins, histories, languages, cultures, and religions come together within the boundaries of a sovereign state with a unified constitutional and legal dispensation, a national public education system, an integrated national economy, shared symbols and values as equals, to work towards eradicating the divisions and injustices of the past, to foster unity and promote a countrywide conscious sense. It is constructing or structuring a national identity using the power of the state with the aim of unification of the people within the state so that it remains politically stable and viable in the long run. Nation building promotes concepts as national economic survival and self-reliance, patriotism, nationalism, cultural heritage, cultural revival, democracy, and technological breakthrough. Our guests on the interview segment of the program today will enlighten us the more on nation building related issues, amongst which are why nation building matters, elements of nation building, and who a nation builder is, among other related issues. Do stay tuned as it promises to be interesting as always.
Joining on to carry us, a public affairs commentator and retired director, administration, Office of the Head of Civil Service of the Federation, Mr. Zubairu Mohammed Abdullahi. Welcome to Lens on Africa, sir.
It's my pleasure having you.
Thank you. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
All right. Also joining us via Zoom, all the way from Sokoto, are Dr. Shadi Sabeb, PhD, Vice Chancellor, Iconic Open University, Sokoto. Also, welcome to Lens on Africa.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Also joining us via Zoom is Dr. Nura S. Akilu, PhD, Department of Business Administration, Usman Danfodio University, Sokoto as well. It's also a pleasure to have you. All right, gentlemen, much ado about national building in Africa. What is national building and why is it so elusive? Sir, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks a great deal, and it's my pleasure being in the studio. Nation building, I should start with, is all about having a nation getting giant strides in developmental areas and various sectors. But let me say that nation building itself is an offshoot of nationhood. Okay. And when we talk about nationhood, it is work in progress. Work in progress in the sense that in every developmental stride of a nation, we assess the level of our growth and then take quantum leap on what next to do.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Dr. Nura, I'd like to get your take on this exactly. What is nation building and why has it been so elusive? Dr. Nura, what is nation building and why is it so elusive in Africa?
Thank you very much. I'll start by saying that the concept of nation building, it's a very complex concept. And to really understand it, you would have to look at the antecedents, where it originated from, and especially in Africa. I would like to see it from the context of disruptions that have taken place in Africa and the aftermath of that disruption. For instance, colonialism. You will discover that after a lot that African nations have gone through, Nigeria to be specific, there are agitations that brought about the need for independence. And such disruptions and the aftermath of the disruptions, the consequence of which is the independence we have gotten. The leaders of the post-colonialism were then tasked with the responsibility of actually building that nation. And there are certain peculiarities that we came to terms that come to terms with in terms of the diverse nature of African countries, because they were actually carved out by the colonial masters. So there are a lot of cultural differences, insensitivity to local conditions, issues of religious differences. And even though the territory is the same, you discover that these differences will require an effort that will integrate and create that emotion. So basically, nationhood has to do with the emotion associated with shared identity. And for it to be built, then two things have to come in place: the institutions that characterize the state, as well as the emotion that brings about a sense of shared identity. And from that perspective, we begin to appreciate the dynamics of nation building and why it is important that we begin to look at those differences, look at our institutions,
Thank you very much,
make the effort to actually, yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nura. Interesting perspective. Dr. Sabe, what's your take?
I think I'd just like to corroborate the last two speakers. Like my very good friend and brother highlighted, we would have to put nation building in its proper perspective. Historically, nation building has been an element that has been attributed to external forces, from without and not within.
Okay.
After World War II, we saw countries like the United States going into, these countries that had become, disaster zones, and we're trying to come out of, the World War effects, recoveries, and all of that. And they tried to see how they could build those nations, linguistically speaking, as simple as it seems, nations, as the definition goes, trying to bring about, unity and values that are, edge-cutting across a society that is diverse. So you try to see nation building from two perspectives. For me, one, the original perspective of other countries trying to build nations that have been hitherto been destroyed as a result of conflict and all of that for their selfish interests. This idea of the security of an African country is the security of a Western country. Now, we have to, in Africa, understand nation building from a perspective of nations built for nations. African building their nations themselves and not subjecting that, activity to external. So we have to look at it from
that perspective.
A local perspective.
All right, so Dr. Sabe, I'll come back to you on that thought, and so I want us to come back here to the studio. So, sir, my comment on that is the issue of shared identity. There is, Dr. Sabe had started on the issue of us building African nations for foreigners, not necessarily for Africans, trying to live up to their expectations and not necessarily the aspirations of the African people. So I want to ask the question now, what are the fundamentals of ideal nation building? What do we need to build before we can properly evaluate if we have built enough, if we have built accurately? What are the fundamentals that we need to say, okay, these are the fundamentals we need to evaluate?
Thank you very much once again. And we have to look inwards. And in looking inwards, we have to start by saying the citizenry. The citizenry in itself is germane in nation building, and enlightened citizenry, for example, well-oriented, given the right of place through the instrumentality of human rights. Going forward, we need good leadership, a leadership that is focused, fast-sightedness, willing to lead the country by giving it the leadership it requires. The leader that has what could be referred to as the dynamics of having to accommodate and to give the people a right of place and sense of belonging. It's germane for us as a people in this country. We also need the intelligentsia, which is made up of our colleagues here in the university or in the academia, are relevant in this case. They need to give us a leeway, to give us more guidance, more direction on how best our nation will remain focused, so that the building will be a project in continuity with the desired result it requires. We also need for conscientization and giving the bridging the gap between the governed and the governors, and in that directive you are critical in this while. We can also go far to say that even the political setup we have to be, reconfigurated in terms of its own values, in terms of ethics, in terms of what it takes to make the citizenry have the sense of belonging and to eschew elements of violence in actions. And even outside the polity that we are talking about, we can also go further to say that we need what could be referred to as a mass education program. An educated society is a society that can easily have place to follow the leadership, and in some cases even give guidance to the leadership beyond even the mass education that we require. We need capacity development in terms of dynamics of areas one. Dynamics.
Sorry, I'm gonna because of time. I'm gonna interject a bit, Mr. Zubairu, because you've given us quite a bit. You've talked about human rights. You've talked about focused leadership. You talked about the issue of putting the people first, and all of that. So, but let me take a pause and let me go to Dr. Nura, and I want to share your perspective, Dr. Nura, on the issue of, you talked about shared identity. Being one of the fundamentals. So I want you to explain more on the fundamentals of nation building, and especially on the issue of shared identity and why it's so important.
Well, for me, the key fundamental for nation building is actually the awakening of national consciousness. Without national consciousness, any other thing that will follow will not come into fruition. The key fundamental is that national consciousness. But we have a problem. The problem is that in trying to develop national consciousness, that sense of identity, shared history, has to be a kind of, it has to be an agenda that is driven by an ideology. The problem we have is trying to approach nation building from a perspective that is devoid of an ideology, that is rooted in the idea of building a nation from an emotional and sentimental point of view, because that is what it takes to have a reawakening of national consciousness. What I'm trying to say here is this. Now, if we look at the African countries nowadays, the ideology that is actually being put forth and is operational is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is actually in conflict with nationalism, because it is nationalism that is in effect the framework that brings about the vision, the ideals, and that sense of identity that will make the working national consciousness to be operative within a particular polity. Because if you take away the emotion and focus on the state and focus on the institutions that characterize the governing structure, you discover that all the issues of development that we talk about are devoid of that emotion. And without which we will continue to be subject to the whims and caprices of the outside global forces. I remember the British minister once, the British Prime Minister in 1960, when addressing the South African Parliament, expressed his concern during that time when Africa was beginning to have an awakened national consciousness. And he specifically mentioned the strength of that consciousness as being the forefront in trying, making them realize the practical reality of allowing them to actually govern themselves. And as far as I'm concerned, once that is recognized, then we'll begin to see how we should not subscribe to the neoliberal ideology, which will not help in nation building. Of course, it could serve its purpose, but for me, I think if we are really talking about the nation, then we should have the right ideology in place, because it will be the framework within which all other fundamentals will follow.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nura. Dr. Sabra, you've been listening to him, and I want to push this idea. So he's talked about shared identity, an ideology-driven national consciousness. How do we develop? Because a lot of the conflicts in Africa have been identity, religion, and culture based across the continent. How do we develop an identity in Africa that it's inclusive and still people do not lose themselves? We're able to be one in our diversity at the same time. How do we develop this?
Well, like Dr. Noah said, we have to awaken national consciousness. But like you asked, I'll just go into, the tidbits, the nitty-gritty issues, and look at, there's so many things we could look at. You could look at education, you could look at, the economy, you could look at the politics, you could look at social development and integration. But I'd like to take this one at a time. And first of all, I think for me, in trying to awaken that national consciousness, looking towards shared identity, is the education. I think we have to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, our kids, getting knowledge or being educated, these are two different things. You get knowledge in terms of knowing stuff, but you're educated when you know what you know is actually impactful. So we have kids growing into adults as Nigerians, going through school, and the question is, what kind of education system do we have breeding, a potential national people, breeding unity, breeding shared identity? For instance, when you have education that matters, education, that is for development and progress. I'm not talking about stereotype education, working on a curriculum that doesn't really key into what we need. For instance, when you look at the economy, how do we groom Nigerians to understand that we need to build our nation economically from a point of view that whenever you import, whenever you buy foreign products, you are building, you are eradicating poverty somewhere else, and you are bringing upon yourself that poverty. How do we understand how do we make our politicians understand that from an educationist perspective, we try to build, a curriculum that targets, national cohesion in politics that matters, politics that is filled with empathy, targeting social institutions through education. For me, the key is education. If we don't get it right, the curriculum needs to build on what would make us progress and develop, and every other thing, I assure you, within a matter of a decade or two, will fall in place.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm going to come back to you on a couple of points, especially on the issue of, you hampered a lot on the issue of building education for national consciousness. And so it begs the question, what is a nation and what makes people or groups secure in a nation? And going back to the identity question. But I'm going to come back to Mrs. Zubairu. So Mrs. Zubairu, let me ask the question. We talked a lot about national development and national nation building. Who is responsible for nation building and why are these people responsible?
Well, foremost, a good leadership. A good leadership matter a great deal. Where you have a leader that is focused, that has the dynamics, he knows the weapons he requires from the arsenals, he will bring them and use them effectively to achieve the goal. He has the vision, he has the mission, he has the timeline for achieving, he knows how best to mobilize the citizenry. And to that extent, such leaders matter in nation building. Such category of people also include, like we have earlier on said, the type of orientation we give to the citizenry. What do we need as a nation? And then how do we achieve what we need as a people? Have we given ourselves the proper trajectory to achieve them? Okay. So the leadership is there, and secondly, the institutions we have in place.
Leadership institutions.
Yes. Okay. These institutions, are they forthcoming in terms of providing the nitty-gritties of nation development? Because nation development cannot achieve its goal. Okay. And the goals are so much. They cannot be limited to just issues of political considerations. They cannot be limited to mere issues of economic development. They go beyond that. We can as well use the instrumentality of building security concerns.
Okay.
to it. And
All right.
added to that is the aspect of social engagement. Institutions that provide social services.
So you're saying
that
that
the people,
fundamentally the people we need to hold for nation building, who are responsible for the success or failure of nation building, and number one, leadership.
That's right.
Number two, institutions within the system.
Yes.
And you hampered a bit on security.
And security.
So you're looking at the military, which is also part of leadership and government. So
that's right.
The leadership, whether political or social.
That's right.
You're looking at institutions, whether political or economic.
That's right.
As well, and we're also looking at government in terms of security.
That's right. That's right. We can go for that to mention issues of the civil societies, faith-based organizations,
civil societies. So
non-governmental organizations.
Okay.
They have a role to play in making us have a leeway in nation building.
So these are, all of these sectors are responsible. They play various roles in nation building.
Exactly.
Dr. Nura, I'm just going to ask this question. I know we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask this question quickly. Can you just highlight to us some of the very key basic responsibilities of these various groups? You might want to add one or two, or highlight one or two that you believe were not highlighted. What their responsibilities are in a very clear and simple, unambiguous terms.
Okay, well, fine. I will still go back to what Dr. Shadi said. Education is key. Why? Because the citizens, generally, the citizens are responsible for nation building, because our leaders emanate from the rest of the society. And therefore, the key elements through education are three. One, you can achieve intellectual elevation through education. You can achieve moral consciousness through education. You can achieve social cohesion through the right education. But the key to getting this right, I will still say it's ideology. Because if the right ideology is not there, then how can you design an educational system that works? In this present dispensation, in fact, even the education system is not subordinated to market forces. Now, if education is subordinated to market forces, how can an agenda that is geared purely towards national consciousness be created? At a point in time, history and geography are removed from the curriculum. Now, without history and without geography, how do you really bring about social cohesion and intellectual elevation? The moral consciousness, which is an aspect of character building, are rooted in education. Now, if education is driven by purely the private sector, as we can see the growing trend now, how then can we be able to curb institutions of education that are private driven? Because there will be no room for these two dynamics. Because you cannot achieve moral consciousness where the students pay their money. You cannot even achieve well, I'm not generalizing here, but I'm saying the traditional mode of actually educating people to build character will be lost if it's money driven. And if that money driven institutions is not ideologically guided. And that is what I'm trying to. It's not all institutions are like that, but we have to go back to ideology, because neoliberalism as.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you very much, Dr. Nura. I see you're very passionate about this, but we're practically out of time, so I'll go to Dr. Sadi so we can round up at this particular point in time. So, rounding up on this point, he spoke about ideology. Who is responsible for building this ideology, and what is the best way that we can do that in just a few seconds?
I think we have to go back to our social institutions. We have to go back to the family. We have to go back to religious institutions. We have to go back to the traditional rulers, politicians, those in government, the private sector. We have to go back to all the institutions that matter. And most importantly, is to give ourselves like a kind of metacognitive approach, whereby we give ourselves a reason, to preach an ideology, that is effective, an ideology that is relevant, an ideology that really, resonates around development and progress and makes it, core to everything that we do. So when the politician understands the ideology of progress, the schools understand that religious institutions preach tolerance and accommodate one another. Traditional institutions understand the gimmicks, the nitty-gritty issues of that ideological perspective that should be driven from a place of sincerity, a place of progress, and understanding that united we stand, divided we fall. And
Thank you very much.
Always progress as a nation if we understand that the ideological base of what we're doing is actually progress as one nation, one people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sade. It's been a pleasure. We've been talking about the national building, nation development, nation building, and my guests have been rather intriguing. Dr. Sade Sabeh, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Mr. Zubairu, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. We've had interesting conversations, and our guests on Zoom, both of them from Sokoto. They've been very interesting. Dr. Nura, it's been a pleasure as Akilu, and Dr. Sade Sabeh, it's been a pleasure having both of you on this conversation.
Thank you very much for having us.